on the morning of February 21st, 1431, in a stone hall in the occupied city of Rouen, a 19-year-old peasant girl was led in chains before a court of more than 60 learned men. Her name was Joan. She came from a village called Domremy. She could not read. She could not write. She had never studied law or scripture or theology. Against her sat bishops, abbots, and doctors of the University of Paris, the finest theological minds in France. The charge was heresy, but everyone in that hall understood the truth. Joan of Arc had helped crown a king of France and had beaten the armies of England in the field. This was not really a trial about her soul. It was a trial about a war. This is the trial of Joan of Arc. To understand the trial, you have to understand that France in 1431 was a kingdom that was losing itself. For nearly 100 years, England and France had been locked in a war that would later be called the 100 Years' War. By the 1420s, England was winning. The English king claimed the throne of France itself. Northern France, including Paris, was under English and Burgundian control. The rightful French heir, Charles, had not even been crowned. Into that collapsing kingdom came a teenage girl from a village on the eastern frontier. Joan said that since the age of about 13, she had heard voices. Voices she identified as St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. And the voices, she said, had given her a mission: drive the English out of France and see the true king crowned. What happened next is almost impossible to believe, except that it is documented. Joan, perhaps 17 years old, talked her way to the heir, Charles. She was given armor and a place with the army. In May 1429, she helped lift the English siege of the city of Orleans, a turning point of the entire war. Weeks later, she stood beside Charles in Reims Cathedral as he was crowned King Charles VII of France. And that was unforgivable. Because if Charles had been crowned with the help of a girl sent by God, then the English king's claim to France was not just weak, it was cursed. The English could not let that idea stand. They needed to prove that Joan's voices came not from God, but from the devil. In May of 1430, Joan was captured in battle near the town of Convenes. She was pulled from her horse by soldiers fighting for the Duke of Burgundy, Frenchmen, but allied to England. Now Joan became the most valuable prisoner in Europe. And her own king, Charles VII, the king she had crowned, did nothing. He sent no ransom. He sent no army. He sent no word. The young woman who had handed him a crown was left entirely alone. The English government paid an enormous sum, 10,000 livres, to buy Joan from the Burgundians. But the English had a problem. Joan was a prisoner of war. They could not simply execute a prisoner of war for winning battles. So they did not try her for war. They handed her to the church. An ecclesiastical court, a church court, could try a person for heresy and heresy, if proven and unrepented, carried a sentence of death by burning. All the English needed was a bishop willing to run the court. The bishop was Pierre Cauchon. He was a skilled, ambitious cleric who had been driven out of his own diocese by Joan's victories, and who was now closely tied to the English crown. He wanted a cardinal's hat. Convicting Joan of Arc was how he intended to earn it. The trial opened in Rouen in February 1431. And from the very first day, it was a court built to convict. Consider the imbalance. On one side sat more than 60 trained men. In total, over the course of the trial, more than 120 assessors would take part. Bishops, abbots, and doctors of theology and canon law from the University of Paris. On the other side sat a 19-year-old who could not read a single word of the charges against her. And Joan was given no defense counsel. In a heresy trial, the accused was generally not granted an advocate, on the theory that no honest lawyer should defend a heretic. So Joan would answer every theologian, every trap, every Latin article, entirely alone. There were other violations, and the men in that room knew they were violations. By church law, a woman accused of heresy should have been held in a church prison guarded by women. Joan was held in an English military prison, in an iron cage, in chains, guarded day and night by English soldiers. The proceedings were run by Bishop Cauchon. One of the court ushers was a young cleric named Jean Massieu. Years later, Massieu would testify about what he saw. The interrogation began. One of the chief examiners was a sharp Paris theologian named Jean Beaupre. His method was to ask Joan questions that had no safe answer. Questions where any reply she gave could be written down as heresy. What the transcript of this trial preserves is extraordinary, because the notaries wrote down Joan's actual words. And those words show a teenage girl with no education calmly outmaneuvering the cleverest churchmen in France. Beauper's first great trap was about grace. In church doctrine, no living person can know for certain whether they are in a state of grace. That is, whether their soul is right with God. So Beaupre asked Joan the question directly. It was a perfect trap. If Joan said yes, yes, I am in God's grace, then she was guilty of the sin of presumption, claiming a certainty no mortal is allowed. If she said no, no, I am not in God's grace, then by her own mouth, she had confessed to being a sinner in rebellion against God, and her voices could be dismissed as devils. There was no third answer. The court waited. The room went still. One of the assessors later testified that the examiners were stupefied. A 19-year-old peasant had been handed a question designed to destroy her and had answered it so perfectly that not one doctor of theology in that hall could fault a single word. So they tried other ground. They asked her about her childhood, about a tree near her village where children left garlands hunting for witchcraft. They asked whether St. Michael had appeared to her naked. They asked again and again about the most dangerous subject of all. The men's dress was not a trivial issue to this court. It was central, because if they could get Joan to admit that wearing it was her own choice, her own stubbornness, her own defiance of the church rather than God's command, then they had her. And there was a darker reason she would not give it up. In a cell full of English soldiers, tight-laced soldiers' clothing was protection. Joan understood exactly what she was kept in. The public sessions ended in March. The interrogations moved into Joan's cell. And then the court's notaries took her thousands of words and boiled them down, first into 70 articles of accusation, and then into 12. Those 12 articles were sent to the University of Paris, the supreme theological authority in the kingdom. The university reviewed them and returned its judgment. Joan's voices, it ruled, were either lies or demons. Her refusal to submit her visions to the judgment of the church made her a heretic. The opinion was devastating, and it was decisive. But Joan, through every session, kept saying one thing that genuinely complicated the court's task. She kept appealing over Bishop Cauchon's head to the Pope. By the law of the church, that appeal should have mattered enormously. A request to be judged by the Pope was a serious legal claim. Bishop Cauchon simply refused it and ordered the notaries to keep questioning. He could not afford to send Joan to Rome. He needed the verdict in Rouen. One of the friars in the courtroom could see the trial for what it was. His name was Isambard de la Pierre. At real personal risk, he was warned. He was threatened. Isambard quietly tried to advise Joan, telling her to insist on her appeal to the Pope. In May, the court moved to break her. Joan was taken to the torture chamber and shown the instruments. The executioner stood ready. The court told her plainly that if she did not submit, she would be tortured. The court held a vote on whether to actually use torture, and here even this tribunal hesitated. A majority of the assessors voted against it, reasoning coldly that a confession dragged out by torture would taint the trial they needed to look clean. So they did not rack her. They had another way. On May 24th, 1431, Joan was taken out of her cell to a cemetery beside the Abbey of St. Wen. A great crowd had gathered. 2 wooden platforms had been built. On one stood the judges. And there, in plain view of everyone, stood something else. An executioner, and a cart, and the wood for a fire. A preacher delivered a long sermon against her. And then Joan was given a choice, there in the open air, with the firewood in front of her. Sign a document of recantation, a paper admitting that her visions were false, and submitting herself to the church, or be handed over to be burned that day. Joan was 19. She had been a prisoner for a year. She had been interrogated for months. She could not read the paper that was held in front of her. And terrified of the fire, she signed it or made her mark on it. Witnesses disagreed forever afterward about exactly what she understood herself to be signing. With the recantation signed, Cauchon's court did not set Joan free. It sentenced her to life imprisonment, perpetual prison on bread and water. And it sent her back to the same English military cell. As a condition of the recantation, Joan had agreed to give up men's clothing and to put on a woman's dress. She did. And then, just a few days later, she put the men's clothing back on. And that was all the court needed. Why she changed back is one of the most disputed questions of the whole trial. The nullification witnesses gave grim answers. Some testified that her woman's dress was taken away in the night and only men's clothing was left for her. Some testified that wearing the laced soldier's clothing was her one defense against the guards in her cell. What is not disputed is the law. Under church law, a heretic who recanted and then returned to their error was a relapsed heretic, and a relapsed heretic could not be forgiven a second time. To abandon her to the secular arm. That phrase was a formula. The church court did not technically kill anyone. It declared the prisoner a heretic and handed the body to the civil government, which everyone knew would carry out the one sentence available for a relapsed heretic: death by fire. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the old market square of Rouen. She was 19 years old. By the accounts of the friars who were with her, she wept, she prayed, and she forgave the men who had condemned her. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, by the testimony of more than one witness, broke a stick into two pieces, bound them, and gave her a small, rough cross, which she held against herself. The friar Isambard held up a larger crucifix from a nearby church so that she could see it to the end. The execution was deliberately thorough. When the fire had done its work, the English authorities ordered the coals raked back so that the crowd could see that Joan was truly dead, so that no one could ever claim she had escaped. Then the remains were burned again, and a third time, and the ashes were thrown into the river Seine. They did not want a grave. They did not want a relic. They did not want anything left. Joan of Arc was dead at 19. But the trial was not over. It had simply paused for a quarter of a century. Over the following years, the war turned again. By 1450, King Charles VII, the king Joan had crowned, had driven the English out of Rouen and almost out of France entirely. And now Charles had a problem. His own legitimacy rested on a coronation arranged by a woman the church had burned as a heretic. So a second trial was opened. A retrial, decades after the first. In the 1450s, with the approval of the Pope, a new church court re-examined the case. It did something the first court never allowed. It heard witnesses for Joan. More than 115 people testified. Her childhood neighbors, soldiers who had fought beside her, and the clerics who had sat in that hall at Rouen and watched. Those clerics now testified to the truth. The missing appeal to the Pope, the interrupted answers, the swapped documents, the illegal prison, the threats. In 1456, the nullification court delivered its verdict. The trial of 1431 was declared tainted with fraud and error. It was annulled, struck out, as though it had never lawfully happened. Joan of Arc was cleared. Pierre Cauchon, the bishop who had run the trial, was already dead and was, long after, formally condemned by the church he had served. Nearly 5 centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church declared Joan of Arc a saint. The teenage girl, burned as a heretic, became one of the patron saints of France. The trial of Joan of Arc was not a court that lacked learning. It had more learned men than almost any trial in this series. What it lacked was the willingness to lose. The verdict was decided before the first question was asked. And so every rule of a fair trial, one by one, was bent until it broke. A 19-year-old who could not read saw all of it, named it, and was burned for refusing to pretend otherwise. If you want to come with us to other courtrooms, to the trial of Socrates, to the dock at Nuremberg, to the day a king of England stood trial before his own subjects, subscribe to the highest court, because a trial is only ever as honest as the people running it are willing to be surprised.